What's up, everybody? My name is Simon Hill. Hit the like button, subscribe, share this video, leave a comment. Wearing one of my favorite shirts right now, and I'm about to get into one of my favorite topics. So a few days ago, I started by reading this article posted on Stanford's website about the meaning of life. This is obviously like an introduction into this topic, and I read through the first part, or at least the first half. I finished the part on the meaning of meaning, supernaturalism, the God-centered views, and soul-centered views. Today I'm going to look at naturalism and nihilism, and then we will not close this topic, but I hope to discuss more philosophical things on my channel, more things that I think about deeply a lot, because since my last video, I've reflected more and more and more on what the purpose of our existence is and how understanding the meaning behind our existence can give us more clarity as we move forward into what life's purpose is. As of right now, my philosophy right now is life is not about being a good person, because good is subjective and it depends on the situation and circumstance you're born into. I think life is about living closely to a code or ethics that we are supposed to uphold. Right? So you are supposed to live your creed, if that is what it means, you know? But I will try to put anything preconceived in my head away, and I'll just read this text to find out what I can learn about other people's views on the meaning of life. So we're reading about naturalism. Where is it? Let's go down here. All right. We scrolled out and lost our spot. All right. So we'll start here. Part 3, naturalism. So recall that naturalism is the view that a physical life is central to life's meaning, that even if there is no spiritual realm, a substantially meaningful life is possible. Like supernaturalism, contemporary naturalism admits of two distinguishable variants, moderate and extreme. The moderate version is that while a genuinely meaningful life could be had in a purely physical universe, as known well by science, a somewhat more meaningful life would be possible if a spiritual realm also existed. God or a soul could enhance meaning in life, although they would not be major contributors. The extreme version of naturalism is the view that it would be better in respect of life's meaning if there were no spiritual realm. From this perspective, God or a soul would be antimatter, that is, would detract from the meaning available to us, making a purely physical world, even if not this particular one, preferable. Yeah, I try not to play with extremes or get stuck in between extremes, because I believe there's always a third way or a third path. I'm not a moderate, but I don't like to just characterize debates like this as just being, one way or the other. But as we look at this, or as I think about it, would a life with a spirit in it, even if I view it in a naturalist way, would that be a better life? Why is the spirit life automatically viewed as more valuable than the natural life? That's the question I have. I just want to understand that, because why would the spirit automatically be better? Sometimes people say we have bad spirits, right? And we need to cleanse our spirit. Sometimes they say we are born in sin. So why would the spirit life be naturally more fulfilling than the naturalist life? Is it because this naturalist life is finite, meanwhile the spirit life is infinite, supposedly? I don't know. But I think we spoke about this last time in the meaningful video. Why is a longer life, the eternal life, considered the goal, right? When life should have a meaning, life should have a purpose. If the purpose is to get from A to B, once we get to B, the mission is complete. So why would we want to have eternal life? What would be the meaning of an eternal life? I have yet to come across that question, and that's an interesting question. Cross-cutting the moderate extreme distinction is that between subjectivism and objectivism, which are theoretical accounts of the nature of meaningfulness insofar as it is physical, they differ in terms of the extent to which the human mind constitutes meaning and whether there are conditions of meaning that are invariant among human beings. Yeah, that's a big question. Is the meaning of life the same for the person in India as it is for the guy in Germany, etc.? Are we all here for the same meaning and purpose? That's hard to find out. Subjectivists believe that there are no invariant standards of meaning because meaning is relative to the subject, i.e., it depends on an individual's pro-attitudes, such as her particular desire or ends, which are not shared by everyone. Roughly, something is meaningful for a person if she strongly wants it or intends to seek it out, and she gets it. Objectivists maintain, in contrast, that there are some invariant standards for meaning because meaning is at least partly mind dependent, i.e., obtains not merely in virtue of being the object of anyone's mental state. Here, something is meaningful partially because of its intrinsic nature, in the sense of being independent of whether it is wanted or intended. Meaning is instead, to some extent, the sort of things that merit these reactions. So once again, I think we are trying to define meaning, and that's the hardest part of this. The objectivists say that there are some things that are regardless of where you're from or how you live your life. There are some things that we can measure meaningfulness in a life, right? While a subjectivist would say it's dependent on what you want out of life. And I think something is meaningful partially because of its intrinsic nature, in the sense of it being independent of whether it is wanted or intended. Meaning is instead, to some extent, the sort of thing that merits these reactions. Interesting. Yeah, that's something to think about more. That's something to definitely think about more. I'll continue, though. There is logical space for an orthogonal view, according to which there are invariant standards of meaningfulness constituted by what all human beings would converge on from a certain standpoint. However, it has not been much of a player in the field. All right, let's go to subjectivism, a deeper dive into subjectivism. According to this version of naturalism, meaning in life varies from person to person, depending on each one's variable pro-attitudes. Common instances are views that one's life is more meaningful the more one gets what one happens to want strongly, achieve one's highly ranked goals, or does what one believes to be really important. One influential subjectivist has recently maintained that the relevant mental state is caring or loving, so that life is meaningful just to the extent that one cares about or loves something. Another recent proposal is that meaningfulness consists of an active engagement and affirmation that vivifies the person who has freely created or accepted and now promotes and nurtures the projects of her highest concern. Yeah, this is something that I kind of always have disagreed with. It just naturally doesn't sit right with me. The idea that life's meaning comes from reaching inner peace or also achieving material things in this world. I think both of these are very vain. Though in our society, we tend to view people who say they want to achieve nirvana or renounce worldly things as of a higher uh, level of enlightenment than somebody who's chasing material things. But I think they're both very vain and very selfish in a way, because when you're achieving only your inner peace, yes, you are becoming, let's say, better for yourself, but what about the world around you that you're influencing? And we also, no matter how we live our lives, have an effect on other people, right? And if we're not trying to influence change in the world, where can the meaning or benefit of your life actually come from? It's almost as if it was better to not have existed than to exist in a world where all you did was focus on yourself constantly. I digress. Subjectivism was dominant in the middle of the 20th century when positivism, non-cognitivism, existentialism, and humanism, not as in human, but humanism as in David Hume, who I assume, were influential. Okay. However, in the last quarter of the 20th century, inference to the best explanation and reflective equilibrium became accepted forms of normative argumentation and were frequently used to defend claims about the existence and nature of objective value or of external reasons. One one's obtaining independently of one's extant attitudes. As a result, subjectivism about meaning lost its dominance. Those who continue to hold subjectivism often remain suspicious of attempts to justify beliefs about objective value. Theorists are moved to accept subjectivism typically because the alternatives are unpalatable. They are reasonably sure that meaning in life obtains for some people, but do not see how it could be grounded on something independent of the mind, whether it be the natural or the supernatural or the non-natural. In contrast to these possibilities, it appears straightforward to account for what is meaningful in terms of what people find meaningful or what people want out of their lives. Wide-ranging meta-ethical debates in epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of language are necessary to address this rationale for subjectivism. There is a cluster of other, more circumscribed arguments for subjectivism, according to which this theory best explains certain intuitive features of meaning in life. For one, subjectivism seems plausible since it is reasonable to think that a meaningful life is an authentic one. If a person's life is significant insofar as she is true to herself or her deepest nature, then we have some reason to believe that meaning simply is a function of those matters for which the person cares. Interesting. So that's how I kind of started my video off. So maybe secretly I'm trying to bash on subjectivists when I'm secretly a subjectivist. Okay? These are my students confirming hours. I'm trying to get paid. Anyway, maybe I am a subjectivist because, for example, me, I live my life by the value that I don't want to be a part of evil in any way, right? I try to distance myself from as much evil as possible. Now, I fall short, of course, because I am not perfect, but by and large, my goal is to be as far away from it as I can, right? Therefore, maybe the meaning in my life is just to fulfill my creed, right? Though I think subjectivists might also have the nature of believing that people should always try to be like them or follow them in that way. But maybe subjectivists, maybe here they're also saying a subjectivist can also, say that this might be his or her calling, but somebody else can have another one. I'll continue. For another, it is uncontroversial that often meaning comes from losing oneself, i.e., in becoming absorbed in an activity or experience as opposed to being bored by it or finding it frustrating. Work that concentrates the mind in relationships that are engrossing seems central to meaning, and to be so because of these subjective elements involved. For a third, meaning is often taken to be something that makes life worth continuing for a specific person, i.e., that gives her a reason to get out of bed in the morning, which subjectivism is thought to account for best. Critics maintain that these arguments are vulnerable to a common objection. They neglect the role of objective value, or an external reason, in realizing oneself, losing oneself, and having a reason to live. One is not really being true to oneself, losing oneself in a meaningful way, or having a genuine reason to live insofar as one, say, successfully maintains 3,732 hairs on one's head, cultivates one's prowess at long-distance spitting, collects a big ball of string, or, well, eats one's own excrement. Oh, God, what are philosophers talking about? Yeah, so if your purpose in life is just to, eat shit, does your life really have meaning? No. The counterexample suggests that subjective conditions are insufficient to ground meaning in life. There seem to be certain actions, relationships, and states that are objective value, and toward which one's pro-attitudes ought to be oriented if meaning is to accrue. I would like to know what states or actions are seen as objectively valuable. Having children, having a family. I think many young people nowadays don't hold that in such high esteem. I got married recently and everybody was saying congratulations, congratulations. But, in general, many young people aren't getting married. A lot of us grew up in homes that were divorced and stuff like that. So, we don't value marriage the same way. We also see it as economically hard, and a lot of us don't think we'll ever have kids or be able to afford it, right? So I don't know. Are there things that are objectively valuable? You know, finding inner peace, having kids, having a family, maybe. But I mean, objectively, I think objective has to have a very strict uh, level to it in the sense that we can objectively prove the sky is blue, right? We can objectively prove that water is wet, fire is hot. Can we objectively say that the values of family, friends, etc., anything, even I'm just giving the example, are objectively values that we all as humans find common value? I think not. I think you'll find a plethora of opinions, right? So say objectivists, but subjectivists feel the pull of the point and usually seek to avoid the counterexamples, lest they have to bite the bullet by accepting the meaningfulness of maintaining 3,732 hairs on one's head and all the rest for some who do. See Svensson. One important strategy is to suggest that subjectivists can avoid the counterexamples by appealing to the right sort of pro-attitude. Instead of whatever an individual happens to want, perhaps the relevant mental state is an emotional perceptual one of seeing as a categorical desire, that is, an intrinsic desire constitutive of one's identity that one takes to make life worth continuing, or a judgment that one has a good reason to value something highly for its own sake. Even here, though, objectivists will argue that it might appear that whatever the will chooses to treat as a good reason to engage itself is, for the will, a good reason, but the will itself craves objective reasons, and often it could not go forward unless it thought it had them. And without any appeal to objectivity, it is perhaps likely that counterexamples would resurface. Another subjectivist strategy by which to deal with the counterexamples is the attempt to ground meaningfulness not on the pro-attitudes of an individual valuer, but on those of a group. Does such an intersubjective move avoid more of the counterexample? If so, does it do so more plausibly than an objective theory? Yeah, as of right now, naturalism, at least the subjective point of view, I can't subscribe to in whole. Uh, I mean, they do make a point when they say that subjectively, if a person finds meaning in some activity, they are fulfilling their need for meaning in life, right? Or they are fulfilling the meaning in life. But the counter argument could always be made, well, what is the meaning for some people who have things that we might consider meaningless, right? Though I would think many people who think they are doing things that are considered meaningless are doing that for a higher spiritual purpose, maybe. I would assume. You know, if you want to grow your hair really long, maybe you're doing it because you're a Rasta and you're trying to connect with your Rasta beliefs and roots. I don't know. I digress. I would think just overall subjectivism, I think, is a silly way of looking at the meaning of life. Let's go to objectivism. Objective naturalists believe that meaning in life is constituted, at least in part, by something physical beyond merely the fact that it is the object of a pro-attitude. Obtaining the object of some emotion, desire, or judgment is not sufficient for meaningfulness on this view. Instead, there are certain conditions of the material world that could confer meaning on anyone's life, not merely because they are viewed as meaningful, wanted for their own sake, or believed to be choice-worthy, but instead, at least partially, because they are inherently worthwhile or valuable in themselves. Morality, the good, inquiry, the true, and creativity, the beautiful, are widely held instances of activities that confer meaning on life, while trimming toenails and eating snow, along with the counterexamples to subjectivism above, are not. Objectivism is widely thought to be a powerful general explanation of these particular judgments. The former are meaningful not merely because some agent, whether it is an individual, her society, or even God, cares about them or judges them to be worth doing, while the latter simply lack significance and cannot obtain it, even if some agent does care about them or judge them to be worth doing. From an objective perspective, it is possible for an individual to care about the wrong things or be mistaken that something is worthwhile, and not merely because of something she cares about all the more or judges to be still more choice-worthy. Of course, meta-ethical debates about the existence and nature of value are again relevant to appraising this rationale. Some objectivists think that being the object of a person's mental states plays no constitutive role in making that person's life meaningful, although they, of course, contend that it often plays an instrumental role. Liking a certain activity, after all, is likely to motivate one to do it. Relatively few objectivists are pure in that way, although consequentialists do stand out as clear instances. Most objectivists instead try to account for the above intuitions driving subjectivism by holding that a life is more meaningful, not merely because of objective factors, but also in part because the propositional attitude, such as cognition, connotation, and emotion. Particularly influential has been Susan Wolf's hybrid view, captured by this pithy slogan: meaning arises when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness. So I think what Susan Wolf's quote is saying here, and what this entire paragraph is saying here, is that when we are attracted to actions or deeds that we consider part of the true, the noble, what is it? The good, the true, and the beautiful, right? If you're attracted to, let's say, going to church and doing charity, that's good. If you're inquired to learning about scientific knowledge, right, that's true. And if you're inspired to write poetry or write songs, that would be considered the beautiful, right? And so if you're attracted to the meaningful things that can be derived in our life, then that would be meaning in life, and meaning is then created. The more I think about this, the more debate I have as to whether all of us have meaning actually. Do all of us have meaning in life naturally, or is it something to discover upon the journey of going about life? A baby born right now, is there a meaning to that baby's existence? I would argue right now, as of right now, as I'm thinking about this, I would argue yes, but in a more materialistic way, as in the baby is born to be a part of the society that they're born into. We live in the age of nation states, and as a nation, as a citizen of this nation, this person is going to be another cog in the wheel, and the meaning of their life is to hopefully perpetuate the nation state to continue to exist. But as meaning without the nation state, as an individual, a spirit, a soul, and a human, the meaning in that person's life, I believe, would be derived from living as close as possible to objective truths. Maybe I'm an objectivist, possibly, because I believe objectively, I've mentioned before, as a Muslim, right? We believe that everybody is born with a clean slate, and we're naturally born with an inherent knowledge of good and evil. We sort of can understand what's good and what's bad. This is why, most people, when they see a person get killed, no matter how old they are, they see, hey, that's probably bad. Don't do that, right? Or stealing, most people generally understand very quickly stealing is bad, right? So I think maybe objectively, the meaning of life would be holding on to objective truths, and trying to live as closely to those objective truths as possible. What would those objective truths be? The objective truth would be that That's so hard to define. That's so hard to define. That's hard. I'm stumped. Listen, if you're watching this video hoping for me to give you answers, that's not the purpose of this. I am literally philosophizing in my head in front of you right now, learning right now in front of you, trying to find out the meaning of life, right? And just really building in my own mind, always challenging myself mentally. Whew, this is hard. This is hard, but let's continue. So, this theory implies that no meaning accrues to one's life if one believes in, is satisfied by, or cares about a project that is not truly worthwhile, or if one takes up a truly worthwhile project but fails to judge it important, be satisfied by it, or care about it. A related approach is that while subjective attraction is not necessary for meaning, it could enhance it. For instance, a stereotypical Mother Teresa who is bored by and alienated from her substantial charity work might have a somewhat significant existence because of it, even if she would have an even more significant existence if she felt pride in it or identified with it. Interesting. There have been several attempts to capture theoretically what all objectively attractive, inherently worthwhile, or finally valuable conditions have in common insofar as they bear on meaning in a person's life. Over the past few decades, one encounters the proposals that objectively meaningful conditions are just those that involve positively connecting with organic beauty, organic unity beyond oneself, being creative, promoting good consequences, such as improving the quality of life of oneself and others, exercising or fostering rational nature in exceptional ways, progressing toward ends that can never be fully realized because one's knowledge of them changes as one approaches them. I like that. I like that. Realizing goals that are transcendent for being long-lasting in duration and broad in scope. Interesting. I like that too. Living virtuously. I like that. And loving what is worth loving. There is as yet no convergence in the field on one or even a small cluster of these accounts. Yeah, the objectivists are like, yeah, we believe life has objective good things that we should try to achieve. And then the objectivists say, what are they? And they start fighting and bickering. That's pretty ironic. All right. One feature of a large majority of the above naturalist theories is that they are aggregative or additive, objectionably treating a life as a mere container of bits of life that are meaningful considered in isolation from other bits. It has become increasingly common for philosophers of life's meaning, especially objectivists, to hold that life as a whole, or at least long stretches of it, can substantially affect its meaningfulness beyond the amount of meaning, if any, in its parts. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the view does sort of get kind of degrading in a sense, because they could say, yeah, your first 20 years of life really didn't have any meaning until you found out that you were going to be, the next Mother Teresa, right? That doesn't say a lot. So that means, the first minute I enter the convent or become the Pope or become the Dalai Lama or even just do like anything that they consider objectively meaningful, does that mean the beginning of my life or any time in between that was worthless? So if I had died the day before I joined the UN and became a peacekeeper or something, my life had no meaning. That's something to think about. I don't know. But for instance, a life that has lots of beneficence. For instance, a life that has lots of beneficence and otherwise intuitively meaning conferring conditions, but that is also extremely repetitive, a la the movie Groundhog Day, is less than maximally meaningful. Furthermore, a life that not only avoids repetition but also ends with a substantial amount of meaning or otherwise desirable parts seems to have more meaning overall than one that has the same amount of meaningful desirable parts but ends with few or none of them. Still more, a life in which its meaningless or otherwise undesirable parts cause its meaningful, desirable parts to come about through a process of personal growth seems meaningful in virtue of its redemptive pattern, good life story, or narrative self-expression. All right, I wish they put movies in there for every one of those examples, but I get the idea. These three cases suggest that meaning can inhere in life as a whole, that is, in the relationships between its parts, and not merely in the parts considered in isolation. However, some would maintain that it is, strictly speaking, the story that is or could be told of a life that matters, not so much the life story, qua relations between events themselves. All right. Uh, that there are pure or extreme versions of holism present in the literature, according to which the only possible bearer of meaning in life is a person's life as a whole, and not any isolated activities, relationships, or states. A salient argument for this position is that judgments of the meaningfulness of a part of someone's life are merely provisional, open to revision upon considering how they fit into a wider perspective. So, for example, it would initially appear that taking an axe away from a madman and thereby protecting innocent parties confers some meaning on one's life, but one might well revise that judgment upon learning that the intention behind it was merely to steal an axe, not to save lives, or that the madman then took out a machine gun, causing much more harm than his axe would have. It is worth considering how far this sort of case is generalizable, and it cannot be to a substantial extent. Whether that provides strong evidence that only life as a whole can exhibit meaningfulness. Perhaps most objectivists would, at least upon reflection, accept that both the parts of life and the whole life relationships among the parts can exhibit meaning. Supposing there are two bearers of meaning in a life, important questions arise. One is whether a certain narrative can be meaningful even if its parts are not, while a second is whether the meaningfulness of a part increases if it is an aspect of a meaningful whole, on which see Brannock. And the third is whether there is anything revealing to say about how to make trade-offs between the parts and whole in cases where one must choose between them. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, that's something I think about. Like, what will my legacy be when I die? And will I have any meaning? Will there be any meaning to my existence, you know? And damn, I got something in my contact. I'm not crying. I'm not crying as I think about death, but I think about death honestly all the time. Thinking about my mortality all the time. Yeah, but will the narrative of my life have some meaning? You know, as I've traveled and been in different places, will there be any meaning upon this? Let's go to part 3. 3.3, Rejecting God and a Soul. Naturalists until recently have been largely concerned to show that meaning in life is possible without God or a soul. They have not spent much time considering how such spiritual conditions might enhance meaning, but have in moderate fashion tended to leave that possibility open. An exception is Hooker 2008. Lately, however, an extreme form of naturalism has arisen, according to which our lives would probably, if not unavoidably, have less meaning in a world with God or a soul than in one without it. Although such an approach was voiced early on by Bayer, 1957, it is really in the past decade or so that this anti-theist position has become widely and intricately discussed. One rationale mentioned above as an objection to the view that God's purpose constitutes meaning in life has also been deployed to argue that the existence of God as such would necessarily reduce meaning, that is, would consist of antimatter. Yeah, I've brought this up before. If we have a meaning in existence, what is the meaning of the existence of the eternal thing that lives forever, that has endless existence? I think that's a very interesting topic to discuss. And also, is the meaning of our life to serve the greater purpose of this being that has eternal existence, or do we have independent meaning aside from the one who created us? I think I agree with this part, that if God did exist, or if you could prove it, it would provide less meaning for us in our lives, right? It is the idea that master servant and parent child analogies, so prominent in the monotheist religious traditions, reveal something about our status in a world where there is a qualitatively higher being who has created us with certain ends in mind. Our independence or dignity as adult persons would be violated. One interesting objection to this reasoning has been to accept that God's existence is necessarily incompatible with the sort of meaning that would come, roughly stated, from being one's own boss, but to argue that God would also make greater sorts of meaning available, offering a net gain to us. Another salient argument for thinking that God would detract from meaning in life appeals to the value of privacy. God's omniscience would unavoidably make it impossible for us to control another person's access to the most intimate details about ourselves, which for some amounts to a less meaningful life than one with such control. Beyond questioning the value of our privacy in relation to God, one thought-provoking criticism has been to suggest that if a lack of privacy really would substantially reduce meaning in our lives, then God, qua morally perfect person, would simply avoid knowing everything about us. That's funny. Lacking complete knowledge of our mental states would be compatible with describing God as omniscient. So the criticism goes, insofar as that is plausibly understood as having as much knowledge as is morally permissible. Interesting. Yeah, the old debate that we would hear, in fact, the introduction that most people get to like atheism or some agnosticism is like, if God is omniscient, omnipresent, and all good, how can he also allow X to happen or do X? I mean, so many examples, and this is one. If he's morally right and morally perfect, the right thing to do would be not to know us, right, at all, his own creation, which comes into, but then if he does not know something, is he omniscient? Does he know everything? That's the problem. All right, turn now to major arguments for thinking that have a soul would reduce life's meaning, so that if one wants a maximally meaningful life, one should prefer a purely physical world, or at least one in which people are mortal. First and foremost, there has been the argument that an immortal life could not avoid becoming boring, rendering life pointless according to many subjective and objective theories. The literature on this topic has become enormous, with the central reply being that immortality need not get boring. All right. However, it might also be worth questioning whether boredom is sufficient for meaninglessness. Suppose, for instance, that one volunteers to be bored so that many others will not be bored. That's a boring job. Perhaps this would be a meaningful sacrifice to make. Being bored for an eternity would not be blissful or even satisfying, to be sure, but it is served the function of preventing others from being bored for an eternity. Would it be meaningful, at least to some degree? If, as is commonly held, sacrificing one's life could be meaningful, why not also sacrificing one's liveliness? Another reason given to reject eternal life is that it would become repetitive, which would substantially drain it of meaning. If, as it appears, there are only a finite number of actions one could perform, relationships one could have, and states one could be doing in eternity, one would have to end up doing the same things again, even though one's activities might be more valuable than rolling a stone up a hill forever, a la Sisyphus. The prospect of doing them over and over again forever is disheartening for many. To be sure, one might not remember having done them before, and hence could avoid boredom. But for some philosophers, that would make it all the worse, akin to having dementia and forgetting that one has told the same stories. Otherwise, however, still finding meaning in such a life. Others, however, still find a meaning in such a life. Interesting. I think, in the Western world, or at least in countries that have been exposed to Christian thought, I think this would make sense. Like, meaning can also be derived from something that can be found as meaningless. Like Jesus, for example, was killed meaninglessly, right? He died a common criminal, was tortured, and just left to rot, right? And the meaning of his life was that it was ascribed to him or told that he forgave all of humanity for their sins with this sacrifice, right? I'm not a Christian. I don't buy into that. But I would say that many people would still say a life that would be made as a sacrifice for others as a greater one, even if it was fully meaningless, would still have a lot of meaning in it. All right. A third meaning-based argument against immortality invokes considerations of narrative. If the pattern of one's life as a whole substantially matters, and if a proper pattern would include a beginning, a middle, and an end, it appears that a life that never ends would lack the relative narrative structure. Because it would drag on endlessly, it would, sooner or later, just be a string of events lacking all form. With immortality, the novel never ends. How meaningful can such a novel be? That's interesting. Notice that this objection is distinct from considerations of boredom and repetition, which concern novelty. Even if one were stimulated and active, and even if one found a way not to repeat one's life in the course of eternity, an immortal life would appear to lack shape. In reply, some reject the idea that a meaningful life must be akin to a novel, and instead opt for narrativity in the form of something like a string of short stories that build on each other. Others, though, have sought to show that eternity could still be novel-like, deeming that sort of ending that matters to be a function of what the content is and how it relates to the content that came before. I think it's low-key, it's probably a waste of time for philosophers to worry about the ramifications of the meaning of life on meaning, right? Because essentially nobody knows if it's probably very likely that there is no eternal life. And if there was, okay, why waste time arguing about the meaning of life in that sense if it is an inevitability? We don't argue about the meaning in death, right? We're arguing about what is the meaning of life. We know the meaning of death is to end life, right? We don't know what happens on the other side, though it can be assumed most likely that we do just pass on, right? But if there is an eternal life, which for all of us, if you believe that, will be waiting for us on the other end of this natural life, why focus on the meaning of this life while in this existence where we don't have the meaning? And overall, it's just an overall waste of time to do this because we can't prove that this actually exists, right? All right. There have been additional objections to immortality as undercutting meaningfulness, but they are prima facie less powerful than the previous three in that, if sound, they arguably show that an eternal life would have a cost, but probably not one that would utterly occlude the prospect of meaning in it. For example, there have been the suggestions that eternal lives would lack a sense of preciousness and urgency, could not exemplify virtues such as courageously risking one's life for others, and could not obtain meaning from sustaining or saving others' lives. Note that at least the first two rationale turn substantially on the belief in immortality, not quite immortality itself. If one were immortal but forget that one is or did not know that at all, then one could appreciate life and obtain much of the virtue of courage. And conversely, if one were not immortal but thought that one is, then by the logic of these arguments, one would fail to appreciate limits and be unable to exemplify courage. All right, let's go into nihilism. The previous two sections addressed theoretical accounts of what would confer meaning on a human person's life. Although these theories do not imply that some people's lives are in fact meaningful, that has been the presumption of a very large majority of those who have advanced them. Much of the procedure has been to suppose that many lives have had meaning in them, and then to consider in virtue of what they have or otherwise could. However, there are nihilist or pessimist perspectives that question this supposition. According to nihilism, pessimism, what would make a life meaningful in principle cannot obtain for any of us. One straightforward rationale for nihilism is the combination of extreme supernaturalism about what makes life meaningful and atheism about whether a spiritual realm exists. If you believe that God or a soul is necessary for meaning in life, and if you believe that neither is real, then you're committed to nihilism, to the denial that life can have any meaning. Although this rationale for nihilism was prominent in the modern era and was more or less Camus' position, it has been on the wane in analytical philosophical circles, as extreme supernaturalism has been eclipsed by the moderate variety. Yeah, nihilism, I would hope, as a philosophy, is not very popular, but in the modern world, like on social media and stuff, and in the films and media, it's definitely very prominent. I think the new Batman movie and many of these edgelord films are just full of nihilistic perspectives and ideas. And I think, growing up, I was a big fan of Tupac, and Tupac's content was very nihilistic, as if there was no meaning in life at all. Anyway, let's continue. The most common rationale for nihilism these days do not appeal to supernaturalism, or at least not explicitly. One cluster of ideas appeals to what meta-ethicists call error theory, the view that evaluative claims, in this case about meaning in life or about morality qua necessary for meaning, characteristically posit objectively real or universally justified values, but that such values do not exist. According to one version, value judgments often analytically include a claim to objectivity, that there is no reason to think that objective values exist, as they would be entities or qualities or relation of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. According to a second version, life would be meaningless if there were no set of moral standards that could be fully justified to all rational inquirers. But it so happens that such standards cannot exist for persons who can always reasonably question a given claim. According to a third, who hold certain beliefs about the objectivity and universality of morality and related values such as meaning, because they were evolutionarily advantageous to our ancestors, not because they are true. Interesting. I like that point. Humans have been deceived by their genes into thinking that there is a disinterested, objective morality binding upon them, which all should obey. One must draw on the intricate work of meta-ethics that has been underway for the past several decades in order to appraise these arguments. In contrast to error-theoretic arguments for nihilism, there are rationales for it accepting that objective values exist, but denying that our lives can ever exhibit or promote them so as to obtain meaning. One version of this approach maintains that for our lives to matter, we must be in a position to add objective value to the world, which we are not, since the objective value of the world is already infinite. The key premises for this view are that every bit of space-time, or at least the stars in the physical universe, have some positive value, that these values can be added up, and that space is infinite. If the physical world at present contains an infinite degree of value, nothing we do can make a difference in terms of meaning, for infinity plus any amount of value remains infinity. One way to question this argument beyond doubting the value of space-time or stars is to suggest that even if one cannot add to the value of the universe, meaning plausibly comes from being the source of certain values. A certain rationale for nihilism that accepts the existence of objective value is David Benatar's intriguing asymmetry argument for antinatalism, the view that it is immoral to bring new people into existence because doing so would always be on balance bad for them. For Benatar, the bads of existing, for example pains, are real disadvantages relative to not existing, while the goods of existing, pleasures, are not real advantages relative to not existing, since there is in the latter state no one to be deprived of them. If indeed the state of not existing is no worse than that of experiencing the benefits of existence, then, since existing invariably brings harm in its wake, it follows that existing is always worse compared to not existing. Although this argument is illustrated in experiential goods and bads, it seems generalizable to non-experienced ones, including meaning in life and antimatter. The literature on the argument has become large. Yeah, I think this is like very juvenile to think like that. But even I was in that state. I remember being a kid saying, I'm never gonna have kids. Having kids is wrong and immoral. Okay. Hold on. Let me reply to these students. They're texting me. Hold on. All right. So I need to. All right. So can you confirm? All right. Can you confirm these hours? Okay, good. All right. So anyway, yeah, antinatalism is I think it's dumb because life also has pains, but it also has joys. And even though the pains are greatly bad, and you don't know what life will hold for that child, saying that it is immoral to give birth to children, I believe that's wrong. I believe that's wrong. All right. Benatar has advanced an additional argument for nihilism, one that appeals to Thomas Nagel's widely discussed analysis of the extremely external standpoint that human persons can take on their lives. There exists, to use Henry Sidgwick's influential phrase, the point of view of the universe, that is, the standpoint that considers a human being's life in relation to all times and all places. When one takes up this most external standpoint and views one's puny impact on the world, little of one's life appears to matter. What one does in a certain society on Earth over 75 years or so just does not amount to much, when considering that billions of temporal years and billions of light years that make up space-time. Although this reasoning grants limited kinds of meaning to human beings from a personal, social, or human perspective, Benatar both denies that the greatest sort of meaning, a cosmic one, is available to them, and contends that this makes their lives bad, hence the nihilist tag. Some have objected that our lives could, in fact, have a cosmic significance, say if they played a role in God's plan, were the sole ones with a dignity in the universe, or engaged in valuable activities that could be appreciated by anyone, anywhere, anytime. All right. Good. Students confirming. Good. I like that. I want to talk about the cosmic meaning, right? I think, yes, we are very insignificant in the billions of years of Earth's existence, the universe's existence, etc., right? But I think if you think that meaning is meant to be valued by anyone, anywhere, anytime, we do leave a record in the space-time continuum, right? My existence, if there's a future computer that is able to bring back everybody and recreate everything that they ever did, right? If we are living in a simulation, which is a reflection of a previous universe or a previous existence, whatever the previous me did or whatever I'm doing now will be replicated by that machine, right? So there is a meaning in that. I am playing a part in the role of the universe's story. So I think there is a somewhat cosmic meaning to existence because we're a part of the record, if that makes sense. Others naturally maintain that cosmic significance is irrelevant to appraising a human life, with some denying that it would be a genuine source of meaning, and others accepting that it would be, but maintaining that the absence of this good would not count as a bad or merit regret. Finally, a distinguishable source of nihilism concerns the ontological, as distinct from axiological, preconditions for meaning in life. Perhaps most radically, there are those who deny that we have selves. Do we indeed lack selves? And if we do, is a meaningful life impossible for us? Somewhat less radically, there are those who grant that we have selves, but deny that they are in charge in the relevant way. That is, some have argued that we lack self-governance or free will of the sort that is essential for meaning in life, at least if determinism is true. Non-quantum events, including human decisions, appears to be necessitated by a prior state of the world, such that none could have been otherwise, and many of our decisions are a product of unconscious neurological mechanisms, while quantum events are of course utterly beyond our control. If none of our conscious choices could have been avoided and all of them were ultimately necessitated by something external to them, perhaps they are insufficient to merit pride or admiration, or to constitute narrative authorship of a life. In reply, some maintain that a compatibilism between determinism and moral responsibility applies with comparable force to meaning in life. All right. While others contend that incompatibilism is true of moral responsibility, but not of meaning. All right. So, left with more questions than answers. I'm still conflicted on the meaning of life. I will do more research and more thought experiments on this topic. But this is something I was interested in. Glad that I read this article. Thank you, Stanford, for making this public. Information, knowledge should be free. Thank you all for tuning in. Peace, love to everyone out there who's watching. And Adakum Lahikan. See you later.